shows a little bit of. So on the left of the screen, pointed out by the red arrow, we have a locomotive from the Grand Trunk Railroad, which, for lack of a better term, was known as heavy rail back then. And you can see it has its own separate tracks over here. And towards the middle of the screen, the two green arrows point to the light rail tracks. These at the time belonged to what was known as the Detroit United Railway. And the main difference between these two different modes of transportation can actually, funnily enough, be found in their name. So light rail and heavy rail, it has to do with weight. Heavy rail, like these low, heavy, monstrous steel locomotives of old, were very, very big, very heavy, very bulky. The light rail vehicles were much smaller, they were a lot lighter, hence they had the capacity to go much faster. They were much more suited to transporting people a lot more efficiently as opposed to things like freight. Not necessarily saying that they couldn't do both, but they were a lot more suited for people. So you may have seen this type of thing referred to in the past as things like streetcars or trolleys. I'll get a little bit more into the naming convention of all of this stuff a little bit later, but then the last thing I'll say about this photo that I think is pretty cool, as you can see, I pointed out with the blue arrow on the right there, that there are automobiles in this picture. So this is actually a very rare picture that shows a moment in time where the railroad, the light rail, and the automobile all coexisted here in Michigan at the same time. So that's why I think this is a very, very cool picture. So how exactly did this concept of light rail show up here in Michigan? Well, the earliest incarnations of this system came from horse-drawn trolleys. And these were trolleys that were on tracks that were quite literally pulled by horses. So you would have 1 to 2 horses manually moving the trolleys along the tracks. Now, this use of literal horsepower was effective at the time, but as you can imagine, it was quite rudimentary and it had its limitations. Mainly, you really could only go as far as a horse would allow you to go, right? So the potential range for where these vehicles could go was pretty limited at the time. And also the speeds were not exactly spectacular because, as you can imagine, you're never really going to see a horse sprinting at full speed pulling a trolley like that. Now, enter this little known discovery that we know that we still use today, known as electricity. So at the end of the 19th century, our society was looking for any and all ways that they could incorporate electricity into their lives to try and just make things better, make things more efficient. And Michigan's light rail system was one of these things that saw drastic changes come to it because of electricity. Now, the manual labor that was required from the horses was, for the most part, done away with. I'll get into a little bit later about why that wasn't necessarily 100% the case, but by and large, for the most part, horses would no longer be required to move these trolleys. The way that these would move is, if you're not really a techie guy like me, very basically, they would be supplied with a direct current of electricity from a powerhouse or a power station that was nearby, and that is what would, for lack of a better phrase, let the trolley move by itself. And it was this innovation that led to the implementation of what was known as the interurban trolley system. So up until this point, you've already heard me refer to this system with 3 different names aside from light rail: streetcar, interurban, and trolley. So what is the difference between all 3 of those, and why do I keep saying them? Because I'm here to tell you right now, they are not all exactly interchangeable. And I thought they were at first when I was first researching for this exhibit, but I quickly came to learn that they are not. Now, the biggest difference between specifically streetcar and interurban can actually be derived from the names themselves. Take the word streetcar. It's 2 words smushed together, street and car. Very basically, what these standard streetcars were made to do was to transport people from one area of a given city to another, and they would stay within the confines of that city for the most part. So for instance, the city of Detroit had its own streetcar system. You could go from one end of the city to another, one street to another, wherever you wanted to, right? Now, the interurban was specifically designed to transport people from one community to another. So this was a vehicle that covered much greater distance, and it also needed to have the capacity to go faster because there were very, very few stops in between those communities. So say, for example, you lived in Detroit in the early 1910s. If you wanted to go from one side of town to the other, you would take the streetcar. However, if you lived there and you wanted to go up to Royal Oak or Birmingham, or maybe even all the way up to Pontiac, that is where you would have to buy a ticket for the interurban. It's a completely separate thing. And you can even see in the picture that's here on the screen, a little bit of a visual as to how these are different. I know the streetcar on the left is a little bit harder to see. It little blends in with the background kind of a little bit there, but generally you can see that the interurban trolley on the right, it was much bigger, it was bulkier, and that was because it needed to be a little bit more sturdy so it could withstand going at higher speeds. When I say higher speeds, I really mean it. Depending on where you were going, how much space there was in between these stops, some of these interurban trolleys could reach speeds as many as like 60 and possibly 70 miles per hour. So imagine these type of trolleys could go at the speed that you are theoretically supposed to drive on the highway, assuming you're obeying all of the laws of the road.
Can I ask a question? This may be silly, but so even back then, they were coming from Detroit all the way out here?
Yes, so I will get to that. I actually am about to get to that right now. So, how exactly did this get here to Birmingham? Well, after the introduction of the electric interurban in Detroit, one of the first destinations that saw an interurban line reach it was Royal Oak. Now, this came to fruition in 1894, and once that happened, pretty much immediately there was more work that wanted to be done to extend the line further out here to Birmingham and then on to Pontiac. And in 1895, so just a year later, a man named Almarin Whitehead, who at the time was serving as the village president of Birmingham, he granted Oakland County the authority to lay interurban tracks directly through the center of downtown Birmingham. And when I say directly through the center of downtown Birmingham, I mean it. It went, some of you who were here before I started the presentation, you saw the picture that I used in the background. The interurban tracks followed directly up the middle of Old Woodward Avenue through Birmingham. So they went directly through the city. So in 1895, the building of the tracks were authorized, and then only a year later, in the summer of 1896, the electric interurban officially arrived here in Birmingham. And to put it mildly, this was a monumental day in the history of the village of Birmingham. And the newspaper articles from that time reflect that. And there's a small excerpt of a newspaper article that I put up on the screen right there, but I'm actually going to read another section of that same article that I actually wasn't able to fit on the screen here. So, quote, "When the 4 cars came through the streets with Mr. Hendry on the front vestibule of the first car acting in the capacity of motorman, the village was out in force. Flags waved, the crowd yelled, everyone was wild with enthusiasm, and the 4 cars quickly sped over the brow of the hill and were stopped. And the day which had been so earnestly wished for had arrived at last. The electric cars had commenced running to Birmingham." And that same article lays it out even further by saying, quote, "It was the most important day in the history of Birmingham, since the first house was erected by our time-honored settlers." So, as you can tell, this was a big deal at the time. And the reason for that was because it made not just the village of Birmingham, but all of the surrounding communities significantly more accessible to just your average person at this time. So the interurban actually kind of, in a way, started the commuter culture that we kind of live with today. For the first time ever, because of this system that was, fast and also efficient, it was actually now not only possible, but actually feasible to live in one town and commute to work in another town. So for example, you could live in, say, Birmingham or Royal Oak and work down in Detroit. At this time, there was a point where Birmingham and downtown Detroit were separated by just a 1-hour trip on the interurban. And now, if you imagine what it's like to drive from here to downtown Detroit today, that kind of checks out. It's about the same today if you account for traffic, right? So you could realistically live in Birmingham, say work in Royal Oak, and be back in time for dinner. So this was huge at the time. And I already mentioned how it gave other regular people greater access to not just Birmingham, but all of the different communities that were surrounding Birmingham, and also pretty much anywhere that was connected to by an interurban stop. And one of the reasons why this type of thing ended up being possible at all, actually, funnily enough, had a lot to do with the rapid consolidation of the light rail industry here in Michigan. Now, prior to 1901, it was a little bit of a cluster when it came to light rail in Michigan, because there were at one point as many as like 25 to 30 different light rail companies that owned and operated their own little sections of interurban tracks in different areas. So they were doing their own thing, making their own prices. They had their own rules. You can imagine how this became a little bit of a pain, right? How it kind of made things a little bit confusing. Well, as the years went on, some of these companies, they merged, they consolidated until in 1901, after all of this, all of these former companies had been consolidated into one private entity. That was known as the Detroit United Railway, or the DUR for short. And the map that you see on the screen right now, this actually comes from an early 1920s pamphlet that was used for advertising by the DUR. You can see, funnily enough, this map that's on the screen right now, this actually isn't the full thing. This is about 60% of the actual map. I had to crop out the left and right ends of it so I could fit it in this presentation. But just to give you an idea of really like how far this stretched here in Michigan, you can see Detroit is in the center over there, but the line that goes all the way out to the right that passes by Lake St. Clair and Anchor Bay, that line actually went all the way out to Port Huron at one point. And on the left here, this line that went from like towards Wyandotte and Trenton, that one extended all the way out to Toledo. Funnily enough, in Toledo, it also connected to a much bigger system, a much bigger light rail system that serviced different areas of the Midwest. And I'm going to try to zoom in on the picture right here. So let me see if this works. If you're wondering where Birmingham is in this picture, Birmingham belonged to the Pontiac division of the DUR. So let me see if this works. If I can get the laser pointer up here. Oh, all right, well, it zoomed out. But so right there, the laser pointer is pointing at Pontiac. And if you follow this line down, it's a little hard to see on here, but in the green right there, this town that I'm circling, that is Birmingham right there. And it's labeled on there, it's just a little bit hard to see. And if you go a little bit further down, you can see Royal Oak right there. So you can see this, at one point, this was very, very, very extensive. So whether it was for something like a daily commute to work, or maybe you wanted to go out for a weekend vacation with your family, or do whatever you wanted to do, the DUR at one point provided very easy access to pretty much all of the major, like many of the major communities that were here in southeastern Michigan at the time. I know every time I look at this map, I think, oh, wow, this would be nice to have now. I live up in Clarkston and I could use that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But in my opinion, another one of the cool things that the DUR offered wasn't just, the service itself, but some of the more special things that you could do. From this company. One of those was their special or deluxe trolleys that you could rent out for a day. Now, one of these was known as the Yolande, and it was one of the most popular, I guess for lack of a better term, party cars that they had. Like this thing was no joke. It came equipped with its own unique interior design that was different from that of the regular trolleys. It had its own special furnishing. It also came equipped with a fully functioning kitchen and its own kitchen equipment. So, if you wanted to rent this out for a day and, have a little, like for a party and have a little sightseeing on the side, this was the thing that you could use. Or the more funny example that I like to think of is if you're just really rich and you want to be kind of bougie, you can rent out the thing by yourself and just, I don't know, have a day. Now, if you were in Birmingham specifically, in 1924, you may have caught a glimpse of another special car that was known as the Oakland. Now, this car wasn't as, I guess, fancy as the Yolande. It was basically it was just a regular trolley that had significantly more luxurious and comfortable seating than the, I guess, for lack of a better term, standard coach seats of the regular interurban trolleys. Unfortunately, I was not able to find examples of what the prices for these would have been back then, but that would be very interesting to find out. So I've just talked for a pretty significant amount of time about how expansive the DUR, the interurban was just overall. Well, let's focus in a little bit more on Birmingham specifically. How exactly did this help the town of Birmingham? Well, remember how I've kept mentioning that it gave people easier access to Birmingham, which means more people were here. Well, almost immediately, this was felt by the local businesses at the time, because it's just a fact of the matter. More people in the town means that there is a bigger potential customer base for any businesses that were operating in the town. Specifically, any businesses that were operating in direct proximity to where the interurban went. And one of these local businesses that benefited greatly from this was Levinson's department store here in Birmingham. Now, if you've tuned into any of our talks in the past, you may actually have heard of Levinson's department store before. This was the very first department store that was here in Birmingham, and it was owned by the Levinson family, who were the first Jewish people to live here in Birmingham and own property here. So, and you can see in this picture on the right here, this image is showing the intersection of Maple and Old Woodward. And as you can see where the trolley is on the right side of the page there. This building right here is Levinson's department store. So that means that literally everybody who was coming in from the north on the DUR, or anybody who was just passing through Birmingham, they would have passed by Levinson's department store. And it would have been very, very hard to not see it out of the window of the trolley, right? So you can imagine how this exposure really helped this type of business. And it wasn't just Levinson's department store that benefited from this. It would have been pretty much any business that was located directly on Old Woodward in line with the trolley. And in case anybody is wondering what this looks like today, if you've ever been through downtown Birmingham, I guarantee you, at least if you've been at Maple and Old Woodward, I guarantee you've seen this building before, because that is the Starbucks that's in downtown Birmingham today. So it looks a little bit different than it did back then. We also don't have a trolley today. So this picture, if taken today, would look very, very different. Now, the DUR and the interurban didn't just impact Birmingham in an economic sense. It also left quite a few physical marks on the village as well. And what I mean by that is there were a few buildings that were actually constructed here in Birmingham, specifically for purposes that had to do with the interurban and the DUR. And one of those was the Birmingham Powerhouse and Car Barn. And you may recall that I kept mentioning that the interurban was powered using electricity, right? Well, if you remember, I said that electricity came from a powerhouse or power station that was in a town nearby. Well, in 1896, when the interurban first came here to Birmingham, we didn't have the powerhouse yet. The nearest one was actually back in Royal Oak. And this actually very quickly presented a problem, because funnily enough, what ended up happening was by the time the trolleys actually reached Birmingham, the electricity that was being fed to them was so weak and so pitiful that it basically ceased to function. So much so that when you're at the north end of the village, in order to get the trolleys up the hill, they would need to, funnily enough, bring out horses to manually pull the trolley up the hill. So in a way, reverting to the ways of old and getting the horse-drawn trolleys back out for another run. So this is why it was very quickly decided that a powerhouse of its own was required in Birmingham in order to make sure that these trolleys could go where they needed to go. And within a year of the interurban being first introduced here in Birmingham, we had the powerhouse here built. So this location that you're seeing in the picture on the left, this is today Old Woodward and Harmon Avenue, otherwise known as Booth Park. So, and then the picture on the right, that is admittedly a little bit hard to see, picture of the interior of the powerhouse.
It's actually at Booth Park or near Booth Park.
No, it was at what is now Booth Park. The building itself is no longer there. So you know where it goes down and then
Yeah.
where like both of the hills come down and meet there, that's where the powerhouse was, right at the bottom, right there.
Merrill is,
What was that?
wasn't our powerhouse by 222 Merrill?
222 Merrill. Not that I know of for the DUR. It's possible that there was something else there. If there was, I'm not sure what that is at this moment. But here, this is a small, actually a very small section of a map that was drawn in the early 1920s. So about in the heyday of the DUR and the interurban. This kind of just gives you a top-down view, tries to have you visualize it a little bit better. The road that is going left to right on this image, that is Old Woodward. You can see the interurban tracks are very clearly drawn right there to show you, how this was laid out like this. And so the building that is highlighted by the red arrow right there at the bottom of the screen, that is the powerhouse and car barn. And when I say powerhouse and car barn, I mean that, this building not only supplied electricity to the trolleys and the interurban vehicles, but it also doubled as a location where they would perform maintenance on the cars and fix them during their downtime. Now, the powerhouse wasn't the only building that was constructed here in Birmingham for the purposes of the DUR and the interurban. Another one was fittingly called the DUR waiting room. And this is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a room it's a building that was constructed where people could wait for the trolley. And in 1910, it was built. Now, you may recall that I said that the interurban came to Birmingham in 1896. This building was built in 1910. So what did you do for those 14 years before the waiting room was built? Well, unfortunately, if you needed to wait for the trolley before 1910, you're probably just going to have to wait outside. Like, that's just the fact of the matter, because there was no dedicated staging area for the trolley, and you would just hop on the trolley while it was passing through, while it was slowly passing through on the road. The motorman would stop it for a brief moment so you could get on, make sure you don't accidentally get run over. But, this simple fact of having people wait outside in the cold, in the mud, in all of Michigan's wonderful weather, it was a very, very big problem for a lot of people here. And so that's why the DUR waiting room was eventually built in 1910. And here is another section of that same map that I just showed a moment ago. And the DUR waiting room is highlighted in red right there with that box. And you can see that there were tracks that were constructed that branched off from the main line on Old Woodward that led directly to the waiting room. That's because the waiting room had its own platform where you could board the trolley from. So you no longer had to trudge through, the snow and the mud in the road to get to the trolley. You could just wait there and, get on, like how they probably should have been doing since 1896. But, and, even today, the prospect of having to do this really, it's not a great thought, right? Having to stand out in the elements and, deal with all the mud if it rains a lot, or all the snow if it's in the winter. And I would even argue that back then it was even worse, because I'm just going to go back one slide really quick. You can actually see, especially on the picture on the left, it's more prevalent, but the road there, Old Woodward, it's actually not paved. It's still a dirt road. This was before paved roads were really a thing here in Michigan. So, if it rained a lot and it was muddy, you're trudging through the mud to get to your trolley. And it's just not a good thing to do. Bless you. So I've just spent the past, 25, 30-ish minutes talking about how great the interurban system was and how, I love it. I wish we would have it today, but clearly something's up here, because we don't have this anymore at all. We have basically no trace of it. So why is that the case? Well, I will admit, it wasn't exactly all sunshine and rainbows for the interurban and the DUR. There were several economic problems that plagued the company, but also there were some physical dangers that came with the trolleys as well. And one was, unsurprisingly, tied to Michigan's weather, as all things seem to be around here. Since paved roads were not commonplace, like I just mentioned, during the heyday of the interurban, heavy rain would cause the ground to become incredibly muddy and nasty. So much so to the point that there were times when the tracks could get completely obstructed by mud. And the picture that you see on the bottom left here is actually a picture of workers in Detroit in the 1910, workers in Royal Oak in 1910, clearing out the mud from the interurban tracks because the trolleys weren't able to move. And not only would rain be a problem, but as you can imagine, snow would also be a huge problem. So large buildups of snow could have the same blockage effect that mud would have, but also, and potentially significantly more dangerously, snow could cause the tracks to become more slippery, which would prevent the trolleys from being able to brake very well. And this was a very, very, very dangerous thing. Because if a trolley was not able to brake, there was a chance that they could take a turn at too high of a speed and there could result in a derailment. And a derailment would have been very, very dangerous for anybody that was in the trolley, whether you were a passenger or a worker or whoever, even if you were just a bystander, depending on where you were when it happened. Now, however, a more deadly type of accident that was significantly less rare than you would think actually involved instances where two trolleys would collide head on. And this happened several times during the reign of the DUR. And sadly, one time this did happen very, very close to Birmingham in 1897. Now, in December of 1897, two interurban trolleys collided head on with one another, roughly 3 miles north of downtown Birmingham today. Now, to give you a rough visual, this would have roughly been around where Long Lake and Woodward are today. And one trolley was coming from the south and the other was coming from the north. One of these trolleys was not supposed to be there because at this time they only had one set of tracks going either way, and they would purposefully schedule the trolleys so that only one was using the tracks at once to prevent things like this. But a scheduling error resulted in two trolleys going opposite ways using the tracks at the same time. So while theoretically this would not have been the end of the world because in theory, the conductor of each trolley would have been able to see the oncoming vehicle in time to stop the trolley. It had snowed a lot the previous few days. So that meant that the tracks were incredibly slippery. So neither of the trolleys were really able to slow down at all. And this resulted in them colliding head on at pretty much full speed. Now, there was enough time for some people to be able to jump from the trolleys and avoid the collision, but not everybody made it out. And 3 men were actually killed in this collision. Their pictures are up on the screen, at least drawings of them that appeared in the newspaper are on the screen. John Kelly, Charles Whitehead, and John Savage were the 3 deceased that from the accident. Now, nearly everybody else that made it out of this accident with their lives was injured to some degree. And that ranged from some who had just, minor cuts and bruises to several passengers who needed to have whole limbs amputated off after this happened. Yes, so this was a very, very, very bad accident. And one of the deceased may actually ring a bit of a bell for you if any of the attentive listeners that we have out there. Charles Whitehead. The Whitehead name has actually appeared in this presentation up until this point. Charles Whitehead was the brother of Almarin Whitehead, who, if you recall, he was the one who was the president of the village of Birmingham, who authorized the tracks for the interurban be built through the town. So you can imagine how this affected him when the news of this broke, because in a bizarre twist of fate, it was his decision to bring the interurban here to Birmingham that actually ended up taking the life of his brother and ended up really haunting him in a bad way. So those were a couple examples of some of the physical dangers that came from the trolley system here. But as we know from American history, if you've read anything about it, you kind of get the sense that sometimes when it comes to big companies like this that own a huge industry all to themselves, sometimes accidents that result in injuries or even people's deaths doesn't always mean that there's going to be immediate action taken to make things safe or to change things. And this was exactly the case with the DUR. While most people assume that the popularization of the automobile was the thing that basically killed the light rail industry, that's not really the whole story. It's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. You know, you'll recognize the picture on the left because it's the same one that I showed at the beginning of this presentation. You know, and there was a significant stretch of time where the interurban, the railroad, and the automobile all coexisted. They were all operating at the same time, servicing people in their own respective ways. So something else was clearly going on there other than just physical dangers and other than just, you know, the big bad automobile came in and took away our light rail. And if I'm being honest, there really isn't anybody else to blame for the death of light rail in Michigan other than the DUR themselves. Now, remember how I mentioned that the DUR came about as a result of all of these mergers of all of these different companies? Well, this actually ended up being a problem in and of itself because as the single private entity that owned all of the interurban tracks and operated it under their one banner, they really didn't have anybody that was there to compete with them. So there was nobody that was there to kind of push them to, you know, make things better for passengers. So they could really do whatever they want, you know, and they were a business. So at the end of the day, the Detroit United Railway, their main focus was to make money. It wasn't necessarily to transport people because transporting people was just the method that they would use to make money, right? And one of the best examples of what I'm talking about actually is concerning the way that they handled their property taxes. Because interestingly enough, the Detroit United Railway owned all of the land that they used for their tracks themselves. And so what this means is they had to pay property taxes on all of that land that was occupied by those tracks. That's a lot of land. If you recall the map that I showed you earlier, that's a lot of land, right? And so as the years went on and these property taxes increased, the Detroit United Railway, generally speaking, passed off these costs to their passengers in the form of constantly jacking up the price of their fares. And so this was one of the big reasons why alternative forms of transportation at the time, such as the automobile, or even in the early 1920s, the first buses in the Metro Detroit area, it's why these types of things became much more appealing because in essence, while they might not necessarily have been faster or more efficient than the DUR, they were a lot cheaper. And generally speaking, I mean, I even know today, most people will tend to do the cheapest option as long as it's not, you know, incredibly less efficient, right? So basically this resulted in, by the mid 1920s, so about 1925, the DUR had lost so much of their ridership that they actually declared bankruptcy in 1925. And just for the few years before this happened, as the numbers were continuing to dwindle, more and more sections of the tracks of the DUR were being municipalized by an entity that was known as the Department of Street Railways in Detroit. Now, it was also known as the DSR. The DSR was not a privately owned company. Today, they are actually known as the Detroit Department of Transportation. So that's really what happened to the DUR. It ended up losing so much revenue, becoming so, I guess, meager that it had to be absorbed by pretty much this government entity, right? And it got municipalized. And so while the DSR did try to continue using some of these tracks and giving this service, you know, by 1931, the electric interurban had completely ceased to be operational here in Michigan. And, you know, some of these trolleys that were used on the DUR were repurposed as just standard old streetcars that were used in either Detroit or Flint or any big city that had its own streetcar system. But by the mid 1950s, all streetcars and trolleys that were used in Detroit had completely ceased to be used, and this system no longer had existed. Now, there were several attempts to revive this industry as the decades went on into the present day. but none of these were successful. One of the most prevalent had to do with an entity that was known as the Southeast Michigan Transportation Authority, or SEMTA. They proposed a large plan that would have involved essentially bringing this back from the dead in the 1970s. But this plan was shot down mainly because of the astronomical cost that would have been associated with bringing this industry back to life. And really, any attempt at bringing the light rail industry back from the dead is pretty much always, at least here in Michigan, going to get shut down by the prospect of what it would cost. Because for all intents and purposes, you would have to build the entire system back from scratch. Even though, interestingly enough, when the interurban system was discontinued and stopped being used, the tracks actually never did go away. They are still with us here today, not just because I'm saying they're a ghost, but they are physically still underneath Woodward Avenue and Old Woodward in Birmingham. So anytime they're doing work where they're tearing up a section of Woodward, it's pretty much inevitable that somebody's going to find a section of the interurban tracks that were running along the road, and somebody's going to be surprised by it because a lot of people don't know that this was here. But even if you were to unearth these trolley tracks and try to reuse them, they are so old and so decrepit, so out of date, you would basically just need to build new ones from scratch. And so that, in essence, is really why we don't have this type of system here in this area of Michigan today, much to my chagrin. So, that was basically the story of, light rail in Michigan and the DUR. Like I said, this presentation was done in conjunction with our new exhibit over at the museum, where we go into much more detail about not just this topic, but all other sorts of topics that have to do with transportation in Birmingham. I'd like to reiterate that the Birmingham Museum is open from Tuesday through Saturday from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. So feel free to stop by if you have not seen our exhibit and if you think it sounds interesting. And also keep in mind, we do have some upcoming lectures here at the Baldwin Library. They're always on the second Thursday of every month. Next one will be in November, and then the one after that will be in January. So with all that out of the way, I would like to now open it up for questions if anybody has some. Yes.
Mexico bought a lot of the subway, or not subways, the interurban. Are they still running the streetcars? I know Mexico bought like a lot of the streetcars.
Okay. All right. So if anybody didn't hear that question on Zoom, she was asking if she said that Mexico bought a lot of the streetcars that were no longer in use, and she was wondering if they are still being used. To my knowledge, I don't believe any of the same cars. I keep saying cars and trolleys interchangeable, but any of the same trolleys that were used back then are still used today. Just because at this point, some of those trolleys would be upwards of 100 years old at that point, and they really would need to be updated and cared for. It'd just probably be better just to build an entire new one. But I'm glad you did point out that Mexico did buy a bunch of the I guess streetcars or interurbans that were no longer in use, because that is true. A lot of them were used in Detroit and Flint, but then once they stopped being used there, where did they go? A couple of them ended up in like museums or on display somewhere, but there were a lot of trolleys. They had to go somewhere, and not all of them ended up in a junkyard. And yes, some of them were bought out by either different cities in the United States or even different countries.
We have a couple Zoom questions.
Yeah.
One talks about the trolley romance in Meet Me in St. Louis. Do you know of any trolley-based romance stories in Birmingham?
That's Caitlin. Okay. Okay.
Caitlin.
Yeah. Okay. So that's funny. Okay. So if anybody didn't hear that question, Caitlin Donnelly, one of our other workers at the museum, was wondering if there are any love stories that came about from the DUR and the interurban here in Birmingham. And actually, yes, there were. So there once was this couple who was known as the Allen, who started the Allen family. So Harry Allen and Marion Clisby, they were two people who lived here in Birmingham, and they met each other in high school. But once they were out of high school and they were working, they both found out that they were riding the same line of the interurban and like the trolley, right? So they Harry Allen would get on the trolley a couple stops before Marion would. And Marion said that when she got on the trolley, every time it happened, Harry would either have been saving a seat for her, or he would give up her seat for her if the trolley was full. So that's Birmingham's very own love story for
Is that the same
DUR.
Harry Allen room that's upstairs?
Yes, that same Harry Allen, he is the man he was the first mayor of Birmingham. Birmingham actually officially became a city in 1933. So that's why I mentioned before with Almarin Whitehead, he technically wasn't the mayor. At least that wasn't what his title was, but for all intents and purposes, he was. It's just because Birmingham wasn't actually officially a city, so he couldn't really be known as the mayor. But Harry Allen was the first official mayor of Birmingham. And also, funnily enough, the museum is actually his house, his old house. That's why it's called the Allen House.
Few more questions on Zoom. How often did the interurban run on a schedule? And how did this compare to railroad passenger service in Pontiac to Detroit?
Good question. So, the frequency of the interurbans, it fluctuated a lot, especially considering like the time period from like 1920 on, as they started losing riders. Obviously, the interurban stopped running as frequently because the operating cost was too high. But in its heyday, an interurban trolley, because by the time I guess the mid 1910s, there had been a second set of tracks that were constructed along Woodward. So there really was no longer potential for a head-on collision to happen like it did in 1897. So more and more trolleys could go back and forth much faster. I would say from my memory, from what I saw, these interurban trolleys would arrive, at least in Birmingham, like on the best day, probably every 30 or so minutes. So, this was at least at that time, this was a very efficient thing. There are places in other countries where, that type of public transit, they have like trains arrive every 5 minutes or the subway arrives every 3 minutes or whatever. This was something that, you couldn't really do that back then because, you just didn't have the resources for it. But 30 minutes between each trolley back then, that's pretty good.
And do you know how many trolley cars the DUR owned?
So I don't remember off the top of my head, but I saw, this is making me so mad because I saw this today, this number. So I believe, as far as I know for a fact when the DSR bought out the DUR in the 1920s, the total number of trolleys that were being used at that time, I believe it was about 3,000. Yes, but you have to remember, that wasn't just here in Birmingham. The Detroit United Railway and like the interurban system, it was very, very expansive. It had all of these different divisions that service different areas of Michigan. For instance, the Pontiac division was actually one of the smallest. It was the division that serviced, Detroit to Royal Oak and then Birmingham and Pontiac. That was it. Those were the stops in the Pontiac division, just 4 of them. Compare that to the line that went out to, I'm blanking on the name for it, but the line that went out to Ypsilanti and then Ann Arbor, and then on to Jackson. That line was significantly longer and it serviced a lot more communities. So that would have had a lot more trolleys that were used to keep up with the frequency of service. Whereas, here in Birmingham, if you're having a trolley pass through about every 30 or so minutes, you'll hit every stop theoretically, in just a couple of hours, right?
Do you know who owned the buses that ran in the 1920s?
Yes. So, as far as I know, the buses that started up in the 1920s, they were not, I don't believe they were publicly owned buses. They were from a private company. I know at some point, the busing system did become a public entity, which is how we actually have like the smart bus system that we have today. Funnily enough, I mentioned SEMTA and their attempt to revitalize the light rail industry. That company, SEMTA, they actually are what morphed into SMART. So the smart bus system that we have today actually came from that.
We just got another one. How many cars came at a time? One car, were they put together?
Oh, okay. So, well, actually, that's a good question. That, honestly, it really just depended on the day. Like, you may have actually picked up, in that first newspaper article that was there, that I showed it like towards the beginning of the presentation about the first day that the interurban came to Birmingham. They actually had several trolleys hooked up to one another, because it was like a small train, right? You could hook up the trolleys and they could move themselves. Um, Generally speaking, that was usually just for special occasions, because generally speaking, it would usually only be one car at a time. Most likely, unless there were a couple cars that were rented out for really, really large groups. Basically, any picture that I've ever seen of the interurban and these types of trolleys in action, I'd say like 95% of the time that I've seen these pictures, it's been one single trolley operating by itself.
I have a comment. I think quite a long time ago, I read an article that at the corner of Catalpa and Main Street in Royal Oak was an actual turnaround area for the
Yes.
ones that are coming from Detroit.
Yes, yes, I'm actually very glad that you said that, because we didn't have that here in Birmingham, but, yes, so if anybody on Zoom didn't hear that, she was just commenting that she read somewhere before that there was a location in Royal Oak where they had a specific set of tracks that were designed in a way so that the trolleys could turn around, and this is actually true. I don't have a picture of it, but essentially what they did was they had a small street that they purposely constructed the tracks like in a way where they could be like turned around pretty much, because Royal Oak was not only a stop in the Pontiac division, it was also the beginning of the division of the Flint division, which went up to Rochester and all the way out to Flint. So they did need an area where the trolleys could turn around, because they weren't always going all the way back to Detroit. Sometimes some of these trolleys were, there in Royal Oak, and then maybe they needed to bump over to the Flint division for whatever reason.
It was right in
And
front
do you have
of
any other questions?
Fronts and
Yes.
Sons.
Question.
Oh, really?
The question is, when was the last streetcar in Detroit?
So the last streetcar in Detroit, as far as I know, there was actually a special like sign that was made for it as it like went through the streets. I believe it was in 1956. Well, if I'm wrong on that, it's 1955. It's one of those 2 years. But like I said, it was the mid 1950s when the streetcars like officially ceased service in Detroit.
Because I can remember there were buses, and then there were like, these, I was a little girl,
Mhm.
obviously, and I don't remember very much. I just remember holding my mother's hand, like a couple of years old,
Mhm.
and we got onto the bus that was in the middle where there was a track, and I remember this pole, and it just really surprised me,
Mhm.
and I just had that memory.
Yeah, so if it was a vehicle that was on tracks, it probably was a streetcar. Because buses, they don't, they have their own steering wheel, their own wheels. Yep.
Close to the sidewalk, it was like the bus lane, the
Mhm.
bus aisle, whatever you call it.
Yeah.
And my father had talked about, taking the interurban from Detroit to go out to Cass Lake.
Yes.
People did.
Yes, it was. Like I said, people would use the interurban to go on like trips on the weekend or go up, up north, I guess, for a vacation. At that time, if you wanted to go out to, I was about to say Clarkson, but it actually didn't service Clarkson. If you wanted to go out to like Romeo or something, or one of like the lakes up there, it wasn't as simple as getting your car and drive there like it is today, right? So you could get in the interurban and go up there for like the day or maybe like the weekend if you had family in that area.
Actually,
that-
this ties really
sorry.
well to a question we have on Zoom, which was, were places like Orchard Lake or probably near Cass Lake advertising to Birmingham because they could.
You know what? Here, I will actually tab all the way back over to that map that I had before. So I'll zoom in and show you. Because, yes, they did actually, because, I mentioned how the DUR was a private company, right? And they wanted to make money above all things, really. And so, yes, advertising was a big thing there. So I hope it's okay to see here, but the line that goes pretty much directly vertical, the red line right there, that is part of the Orchard Lake division. And this division, at like over near Farmington, it branched off, to the east and then, well, actually, I guess more to the north and a little bit more to the south. Directions are kind of hazy on this because this is a drawing. It's not like an actual, like physical, like picture of a map or something. This is like an artist's interpretation. But yes, funnily enough, one of the things that actually they advertised, the DUR did, was they did this thing. It was called like, I guess the best way to describe it, like a triangle trip, where basically you would start in Detroit, you would go up the Pontiac division all the way to Pontiac, and then you would go across the Orchard Lake division, stop in some areas in Orchard Lake, and then you would go across to Farmington and then out to Northville, and you would eventually make your way to Plymouth, and then you would eventually get onto the Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor and Jackson line, and you would make your way back to Detroit. And this was advertised as like a whole day event because it was like, it would take you the entire day to do this. And, it was basically like a little sightseeing tour that they advertised at the time. So you have to think like, they did these types of things in conjunction with their regular like service that they provided to people, at different times.
And it didn't go to Howell, obviously. I mean, everything stopped.
Yes. So on the map here, if you're seeing, any of you can see a lot of the communities that are up there
Yeah.
are labeled, but there's no red line going out there. That's because the tracks were never built out there. So, all of those communities out there like Milford, like Howell, Holly and Fenton, also Clarkson, like they didn't have interurban service. Now, had the company survived longer, I'd like to imagine that they probably would have eventually ended up servicing these communities. If we had it today and it was like, feasible and it was making a lot of money, obviously this would have been expanded even more than it is. But even for the time, this was revolutionary, right?
Time for one more question.
Fairgrounds.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to take away from somebody else. I've already asked a few.
We had one on the Zoom, basically asking if the person who ran the car, I'm guessing they mean the driver, had the ability to communicate with the dispatcher, or was there any communication?
So that's a good question. So at the beginning, they would have, and this actually kind of ties into, that accent that I was talking about, like scheduling errors, communication errors. This was one of the things that at the beginning was a big problem, because unless you were at the station, you had access to the telegraph that was there, you really couldn't communicate with anybody else if somebody messed something up. Say if two trolleys were on the track at the same time, you wouldn't know until you saw it, right? So as time went on, like the telegraph became a lot more popular, but the telephone would have been very, very useful for something like this. But as far as I know, they didn't communicate very much with the stations while they were out on the tracks, because the intention was to have these schedules cemented enough to where there really wasn't room for mistakes. As time went on, things like head-on collisions really didn't happen as much, specifically because they built a second set of tracks on the Pontiac division that prevented this. I keep doing that. That prevented this from happening, right? But at the beginning, that would have been a big problem.
Well, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'm getting closer to your microphone since I don't have a microphone. No, fine. So thanks everyone for joining us here tonight. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, people who came out and saw us in person. And just as Justin mentioned, that on November 14th is the next Birmingham Museum program, Birmingham's Early Aviators and Their Exploits at 7 p.m. both in person and on Zoom. So be sure to go over to the library's website, or you can come here and sign up. And we hope to see you next month. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight.